There is an unwritten rule in Hollywood: never trust a character with perfect morals. For decades, millions of Americans viewed MASH's Colonel Potter as the ultimate steady, benevolent national grandfather. But the Los Angeles Police Department files hold a very different piece of evidence. In July 1996, this 81-year-old moral icon was hauled away in handcuffs, booked on felony domestic battery. The victim was his 70-year-old wife, who sustained severe injuries inside their luxury home. This examines the mechanics of a public relations diversion, contrasting an on-screen moral pillar with the reality of a domestic altercation. Brentwood, California is a fortress built out of real estate. It is a neighborhood specifically designed to keep the reality of Los Angeles out. The streets are lined with heavy iron gates, dense security hedges, and private patrol vehicles idling at intersections. Entertainment executives, legacy actors, and industry power brokers buy property here to purchase isolation. They want a physical barrier between their private lives and the public that consumes their products. In Brentwood, problems are usually handled with quiet phone calls to fixers and private attorneys, never with a 911 dispatch. On a July evening in 1996, that expensive silence fractured. A call came into the LAPD Communications Center, originating from one of these high-net-worth addresses. The dispatcher on the board did not hear a fan trespassing or a complaint about paparazzi. The voice on the line was reporting an active domestic disturbance with injuries. In the Los Angeles Police Department, a domestic violence call is considered one of the most volatile and dangerous situations a patrol unit can walk into. The dispatcher broadcasted the address, and a black and white cruiser was sent rolling up into the quiet hills of the West Side. The responding officers were veterans of the West Los Angeles Division. They were accustomed to dealing with wealthy residents who believed their tax brackets exempted them from the penal code. But a domestic battery call requires a very specific, rigid protocol. Upon arrival at this type of dispatch, officers follow a rigid mandate to establish physical control of the scene and determine if a penal code violation has occurred. They parked the cruiser, approached the heavy front door, and made entry into the residence. The interior of the home stood in stark contrast to the violence they were about to document. These houses are immaculate, staged like movie sets with high-end furniture and expensive art. But the officers immediately focused on the human element in the room. They found a 70-year-old woman named Barbara Bushman. The physical impact of the altercation was immediately apparent. Police reports are clinical documents cataloging physical trauma, contusions, and lacerations rather than emotion or tragedy. The officers noted that Bushman had a severely swollen eye, indicating a direct, heavy strike to the face. Her arms showed dark bruising, which are universally recognized in law enforcement as defensive wounds. These are the marks left behind when a victim raises their arms to block incoming strikes. Another significant piece of physical evidence was found on the floor. Bushman sustained lacerated feet. In an assault investigation, some experts note that this type of injury profile often indicates a chaotic physical struggle, suggesting the victim may have been forced across debris. The scene presented physical evidence of a severe assault inflicted upon a senior citizen, eliminating the possibility of an accidental fall. The officers separated the victim and began their standard field interviews. They photographed the injuries, establishing the chain of evidence required by the district attorney's office. Under California law, when a domestic dispute results in visible traumatic injury, the officers lose their discretion. They cannot simply issue a warning or tell the parties to cool off. The law mandates an arrest. The charge elevates from a simple misdemeanor to a felony. After securing the victim, the officers turned their attention to the perpetrator. Sitting in the residence was an 81-year-old man. For a brief second, the responding officers had to process a massive cognitive disconnect. The suspect they were preparing to arrest was Harry Morgan. This was the man the entire country knew as Colonel Sherman T. Potter. He was the grandfather of American television, the voice of reason for an entire generation of viewers. The face staring back at the cops was identical to the face that had anchored the most watched television finale in history. Network marketing departments had spent millions convincing the public of his integrity, a corporate illusion entirely overridden by the California Penal Code. The physical evidence of the bleeding 70-year-old woman in the other room completely overrode the legacy of MASH. The officers approached Morgan to initiate the arrest. There is no dignified way to take an 81-year-old man into custody, but the procedure is inflexible. They instructed Morgan to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The metal handcuffs were pulled from the duty belt and snapped securely around his wrists. The ratchet mechanism of the cuffs secured his wrists, systematically dismantling a carefully constructed Hollywood illusion. Morgan was read his Miranda rights. Inside his own luxury home, he was informed of his right to remain silent and his right to an attorney. The officers then walked him out the front door. This is the moment where the power dynamic of the entertainment industry completely fails. You cannot charm your way out of a felony arrest, and your agent cannot negotiate the terms of your transport. Morgan was placed into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the LAPD cruiser. The drive down from the Brentwood Hills to the West Los Angeles station is a descent from privilege back into reality. The cruiser bypassed the studios and the executive office buildings, pulling directly into the sally port of the precinct. The officers removed Morgan from the vehicle and walked him through the heavy security doors. The revered actor commanding a soundstage transitioned immediately into a standard suspect entering the county jail's processing machinery. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights are harsh and the floors are scuffed linoleum. The booking process is designed to strip away individual identity. Morgan was brought to the desk where he was ordered to empty his pockets. His personal effects were cataloged and placed in a plastic bag. He was instructed to remove his belt and shoelaces to prevent self-harm in the holding cell. The desk sergeant logged the intake, typing the name Harry Morgan and the charge of felony spousal battery into the central computer system. The processing continued with the physical documentation of the suspect. Morgan's fingers were pressed onto the ink pad and rolled onto the standard 10-print card. Then came the mugshot. He was positioned in front of the height chart, holding the booking placard. The camera flashed, permanently recording the 81-year-old television icon in the exact same format used for gang members and armed robbers. That photograph became property of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Once the booking was complete, Morgan was escorted to a holding cell. The heavy steel door slid shut, locking him in a small concrete room with a metal bench and an exposed toilet. he was left alone to wait out the process. At 81 years old, accustomed to private trailers and personal assistance, he was now entirely dependent on the custody deputies for a cup of water or a phone call. The reality of his actions had manifested into absolute physical confinement. While Morgan sat in lockup, the ripple effect of the arrest began to spread through the precinct. Police departments are massive gossip machines, especially in Los Angeles. When a high-profile celebrity is sitting in a cell, the information does not stay contained in the booking room for long. Desk officers talk to patrolmen, and patrolmen talk to their supervisors. Within an hour, dozens of people inside the building knew that Colonel Potter had been arrested for beating his wife. This specific type of information is highly combustible. In 1996, the tabloid industry was a vicious, well-funded machine. Reporters paid off tipsters inside police precincts, hospitals, and courthouses to get the jump on celebrity scandals. A felony domestic violence arrest involving one of the most beloved television figures in American history was a front-page goldmine. The clock started ticking the moment Morgan's name hit the intake ledger. The LAPD brass was informed of the high-profile arrest to prepare for the inevitable media onslaught. The watch commander understood the optics of the situation. An elderly television star charged with a violent felony would draw camera crews to the front steps of the station by sunrise. They ensured all the paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. If the department was going to hold a Hollywood institution, the physical evidence and the procedural reports had to be flawless to withstand the coming legal assault. The booking sheets detailed the exact nature of the charge. California Penal Code 273.5 deals with corporal injury to a spouse resulting in a traumatic condition. The officers meticulously documented the swollen eye, the defensive bruising, and the lacerated feet to justify the felony enhancement. They knew Morgan's legal team would attempt to secure a medical release or claim the injuries were accidental. The written report was the only shield the officers had against the multi-million-dollar defense attorneys about to enter the fray. Back in Brentwood, the crime scene was processed and cleared. The yellow tape was removed, but the damage was permanent. Barbara Bushman was left to deal with the physical aftermath of the assault and the sudden absence of her husband. The quiet luxury of the house offered no protection against the violence that had occurred inside it. The illusion of their stable grandfatherly home life had been violently shattered and documented in triplicate by the authorities. As the night deepened, the situation transitioned from a police matter into a high-stakes corporate emergency. Morgan used his phone call. He did not just need a standard criminal defense lawyer, he needed the Hollywood crisis management apparatus. The information had to flow up the chain of command quickly. The arrest of Harry Morgan was not just a personal tragedy. It was a direct threat to a massive financial ecosystem built entirely on his clean, moral image. Somewhere in Los Angeles at 3 a.m, a phone rang in the bedroom of a high-level studio fixer. The voice on the other end delivered the cold facts from the West L.A. precinct. Harry Morgan was in a holding cell. The charge was felony battery. The victim was an elderly woman. The studio executive sat up in the dark, realizing that the syndication revenue of one of the most profitable television properties in history was suddenly standing on the edge of a cliff. Network television in 1975 was a ruthless, monopolistic machine. There were only 3 major broadcasting networks, and they controlled exactly what the American public consumed every single night. At CBS, the executives occupying the corner offices focused strictly on advertising real estate and maximizing profit margins, entirely bypassing art or critical acclaim. Their most valuable piece of property was a half-hour block on Tuesday nights, occupied by a military comedy. When the show's lead comedic anchor, McLean Stevenson, announced he was quitting, the corporate panic was immediate. Stevenson wanted out of his restrictive contract to chase movie stardom and a bigger weekly paycheck. The network viewed this as an act of treason against their highly profitable structure. They realized their primary revenue generator was suddenly vulnerable to changing viewer habits. The executives needed to neutralize the threat and establish total dominance over the cast. They removed Stevenson's character from the show with absolute finality on primetime television. In the season 3 finale, his character, Henry Blake, boarded a transport plane that was brought down over the Sea of Japan. It was a brutal, calculated warning to the rest of the actors about who held the ultimate power. But the shock tactic created a massive operational problem for the upcoming season. The show was suddenly without a commanding officer, and nervous advertisers were threatening to pull their money. The studio executives marched down to the writer's room with a strict, inflexible mandate. They needed a replacement character who was completely bomb-proof and financially reliable. They could not risk another goofy, unpredictable commander who might alienate the older demographic or decide to break his contract. The new character had to project absolute, unwavering stability to keep the advertisers writing checks. The writers were ordered to engineer a moral anchor that could hold the entire franchise in place. The writing staff designed Colonel Sherman T. Potter specifically to be the anti-Henry Blake. He was drafted on paper as a regular Army veteran, a man who respected the chain of command and carried a heavy moral gravity. They stripped away any hint of incompetence or marital infidelity from his character profile. Potter was built to be a Midwestern rock, an immovable force of decency. This was not a creative choice. It was a corporate directive masquerading as character development. To sell this new corporate construct to the public, they needed a very specific face. Hollywood casting directors do not just look for acting talent, they look for psychological triggers. They needed a man whose physical appearance instantly communicated authority, old school values, and grandfatherly warmth. They scoured the Rolodexes for aging character actors who were desperate for a steady, high-paying gig. They bypassed the erratic stars and the heavy drinkers, looking for a reliable studio workhorse. They landed on Harry Morgan, a 60-year-old veteran of the business who had been grinding out supporting roles for decades. Morgan had previously guest starred on the show as a deranged racist general, but the network did not care about continuity. They only cared about his demographic appeal and his work ethic. He had spent years on television police procedurals, establishing a baseline of law and order trust with the American public. The network bought his face to sell security to their advertisers. His physical features were perfectly suited for the psychological operation the network was running. His face was deeply lined, his voice was gravelly but measured, and he possessed the exact physical dimensions of a retired cavalry officer. He was hired to be a human shield for the franchise, tasked with absorbing any negative public reaction to the cast changes. The network drafted an ironclad contract, locking him into a multi-year deal. They handed him the olive drab uniform and put him to work. Once Morgan was on the payroll, the writers systematically weaponized his dialogue to build the saint persona. Every script was meticulously engineered to force-feed Potter's virtues directly into the American living room. They gave him a horse named Sophie to establish a deep, empathetic connection with animals. They wrote scenes where he painted portraits in his tent, signaling a quiet, refined intellect beneath the military gruffness. He was programmed to be the perfect, idealized father figure. Most importantly, the writers hammered home his absolute, unquestionable fidelity to his wife, Mildred. While the other characters chased nurses and engaged in chaotic affairs, Potter was anchored to a photograph on his desk. He was never allowed a moment of moral weakness or temptation. The network effectively turned him into a fictional deity, stripped of normal human flaws. They created a two-dimensional saint because saints do not scare away the companies buying commercial time. Building the character on the soundstage was only half the job. The CBS publicity department launched a massive, coordinated offensive to merge Harry Morgan with Sherman Potter in the public consciousness. In the 1970s, print magazines dictated the national conversation, and the network controlled the access. They arranged highly regulated interviews and cover shoots with compliant journalists. They fed the press specific talking points about Morgan's quiet life, his professionalism, and his solid family values. Publicists stood just off camera during every interview, ensuring Morgan never broke character. He was instructed to speak with the same measured, folksy wisdom as his television counterpart. The goal was to completely blur the lines between reality and fiction. The studio wanted the audience to believe that Harry Morgan was simply playing himself. This deliberate conflation of actor and character is the most effective marketing trick in the entertainment industry. This public relations strategy was entirely driven by cold, hard data. The television industry relies heavily on a metric called the Q-score, which measures the familiarity and trust appeal of a celebrity. The network needed Morgan's Q-score to reach astronomical levels to justify the production costs. High trust meant high viewership, and a dedicated viewership allowed the sales department to charge extortionate rates for a 30-second commercial spot. Morgan's perceived morality was directly translated into network revenue. The public bought the manufactured lie completely. Millions of viewers genuinely believed that the decency they saw on their television screens was the biological reality of the actor reciting the lines. They sent fan mail to Morgan asking for fatherly advice and moral guidance. The network executives watched the ratings stabilize and the advertising money flood back into their accounts. The crisis of McLean Stevenson's departure had been successfully neutralized by the deployment of Harry Morgan. While the audience absorbed the comforting illusion at home, the reality of producing the show was a brutal industrial grind. The cast shot exterior scenes at a state park in punishing, unpredictable conditions. They worked in freezing mud during the winter months and blistering heat during the California summers. The shooting schedules regularly stretched into grueling 14 and 16-hour days under massive hot lighting rigs. It was an exhausting physical endurance test masquerading as a comedy production. Morgan was an aging man forced to maintain a punishing pace to keep the production machine fed. He essentially functioned as a high-paid laborer working a television assembly line. The directors demanded multiple takes, forcing him to stand in the heat in full military gear until they got the perfect shot. He suffered through the physical toll quietly, knowing that his lucrative contract depended on his compliance. The grandfatherly warmth seen on screen was often masking deep physical exhaustion. Morgan treated the role like a construction worker treats a specialized tool. It was a mechanism used strictly to extract a paycheck from a massive corporation. He was notoriously efficient, showing up, hitting his marks, and immediately retreating to the isolation of his trailer. By passing artistic character motivation, he memorized the dialogue, delivered the tone, and collected his payment. The production required this exact professional detachment, favoring a predictable machine over an actor, causing operational delays. But this detachment also meant Morgan was entirely disconnected from the moral weight of the character he played. He maintained a rigid facade for 16 hours a day, projecting manufactured corporate virtues. The psychological strain of maintaining a flawless public facade while working a brutal schedule began to accumulate. By the late 1970s, the television landscape shifted and the show transitioned from a weekly hit into a financial behemoth. The studio began selling syndication rights to local broadcast affiliates across the country. This meant reruns were playing in every major media market, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. The revenue generated from these secondary contracts quickly dwarfed the initial broadcast profits. The studio executives suddenly realized they were sitting on a multi-billion-dollar asset. The property was no longer just a piece of primetime entertainment. It was a permanent corporate annuity. This syndication gold rush drastically changed the dynamic between the network and the cast. The actors were no longer just employees. They were the faces of a massive, ongoing financial operation. The network realized that the rerun money was entirely dependent on the show remaining wholesome, comforting, and completely untainted by real-world controversy. The studio tightened its grip on Morgan's public image to protect their investment. He was instructed to maintain a spotless profile, avoid controversial statements, and keep his private life completely locked down. They embedded morality clauses into contracts, giving them the power to destroy an actor financially if they stepped out of line. Morgan was no longer just an actor memorizing lines in Malibu. He was the custodian of a billion-dollar brand, forced to live up to an impossible standard. If any of the main actors were involved in a massive public scandal, the local affiliates would pull the episodes to avoid advertiser boycotts. The studio made it clear that any deviation from the established public relations narrative would be dealt with ruthlessly. Morgan had to be Colonel Potter when he went to the grocery store, when he ate at a restaurant, and when he attended industry events. The network effectively bought his public identity and mandated that he remain a saint. The pressure to maintain the illusion was immense, but the financial rewards kept the cast compliant. In February 1983, the network squeezed the final drop of primary broadcast revenue from the property. The series finale aired to an estimated 125 million viewers, bringing the country to a standstill. It remains a staggering, almost incomprehensible number in the modern, fragmented media landscape. Over half the population of the United States sat in their living rooms and watched Harry Morgan give his final salute. For the network executives, the finale was a moment of absolute, unmitigated triumph. They had successfully managed the asset for 11 years and avoided any major derailments. They had replaced a volatile lead actor with a compliant workhorse and multiplied their profits exponentially. They cemented the property in television history without a single blemish on its public record. The executives collected their massive bonuses and prepared to count the syndication money for the rest of their lives. When the final credits rolled, Harry Morgan was 68 years old. He assumed his heavy contractual obligations were over and he could quietly fade into a comfortable, wealthy retirement. He packed up his dressing room, left the studio lot, and prepared to shed the heavy olive drab uniform for good. But the corporate machine does not let its most profitable assets simply walk away. Because of the aggressive syndication deals, Colonel Potter was still on television every single day. The studio demanded that Morgan continue to act as the living embodiment of the character at public appearances. They required him to show up at award shows, charity events, and anniversary retrospectives. He was expected to smile, recite his famous catchphrases, and project the same grandfatherly warmth he had sold them for years. They had built a lucrative golden cage around his persona, and they fully expected him to live the rest of his life inside it. Every time a fan approached him on the street expecting a warm embrace, the pressure compounded. Morgan could never have a bad day in public, snap at a waiter, or show the normal frustrations of an aging man. The studio's marketing department had painted him into a corner where simple human irritability was viewed as a betrayal of his brand. He was a highly paid prisoner of his own face, locked into a standard of behavior that no actual human being could sustain. The disparity between the man and the myth was widening every single year. Industry insiders knew the truth about the toll this kind of character acting takes on a performer. You cannot suppress your own personality for decades without it finding an alternate route to the surface. The network executives did not care about the psychological damage. They only cared about the quarterly earnings reports. As long as the public believed the lie, the studio would continue to enforce it with lawyers and publicists. They had effectively weaponized Morgan's own success against him, ensuring he could never truly retire from being Colonel Potter. Behind the gates of his Brentwood home, the cameras were finally turned off. There were no publicists to monitor his tone, no directors to call cut, and no audience to applaud his folksy wisdom. The discipline required to maintain the television saint evaporated the moment he walked through his front door. He was left alone with his aging wife and a lifetime of suppressed industry stress. The network had paid millions to control his public behavior, but they had zero jurisdiction over what happened in his private living room. The studio had built a flawless machine to generate revenue, but they forgot to account for human failure. They assumed the money and the fame would be enough to keep their asset compliant until his death. They fundamentally misunderstood that the very act of forcing a man to play a saint inevitably breeds resentment. The executives moved on to their next projects, leaving an unresolved operational liability in the affluent hills of Los Angeles. The gap between Sherman T. Potter and Harry Morgan was about to be documented in physical evidence. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office operates out of a brutalist concrete fortress downtown. It is a legal factory designed to process human failure on an industrial scale. The prosecutors walking those halls do not care about Nielsen ratings, cultural impact, or television history. They deal exclusively in penal codes, witness statements, and crime scene photography. When the Harry Morgan file landed on an intake desk, it was just another manila folder in a massive stack of domestic violence cases. In the summer of 1996, the DA's office was highly sensitized to high-profile violence and celebrity entitlement. They were not in the mood to grant quiet favors to Hollywood royalty operating outside the law. The intake prosecutor opened the folder and pulled out the physical evidence report generated by the responding patrolmen. This document is the foundational architecture of any criminal prosecution. It translates the chaotic reality of a physical assault into sterile, actionable legal data. When the DA's intake prosecutor reviewed the patrolman's physical evidence report, the legal translation was unambiguous. Under California Penal Code Section 273.5, if an assault results in a traumatic condition, meaning any visible wound or internal injury, the state rigidly upgrades the charge from a simple misdemeanor. When a prosecutor looks at lacerated feet combined with severe facial trauma and defensive bruising, they do not see an aging, beloved actor having a bad night. They see a slam-dunk felony conviction. The visual evidence completely destroyed any defense narrative of an accidental fall, providing the state with a textbook foundation for a felony enhancement. The state of California was now preparing to drop the hammer on a television legend. The defense strategy in these high-stakes celebrity situations is highly predictable and heavily funded. Wealthy Hollywood clients immediately hire premium, white-shoe defense firms to stop the legal bleeding before the press finds out. These lawyers charge $1,000 an hour to exploit technicalities, bury paperwork, and intimidate witnesses. The legal team hired to protect Harry Morgan mobilized within hours of his release from custody. Their primary objective was to intercept the police reports before the DA formally filed the charges with the court clerk. Defense attorneys know that their best weapon in a crisis is controlling the initial medical narrative. They immediately attempted to build a legal firewall around Morgan by blaming the entire incident on his advanced age. They prepared preliminary statements suggesting that an 81-year-old man lacked the physical capacity to inflict intentional felony-level harm. They wanted the DA to view Morgan as a confused, frail, elderly patient, rather than a violent, capable criminal. The defense team explored every possible medical excuse to explain away the violence documented in the police report. They looked into adverse reactions to prescription medications, hoping to find a chemical scapegoat for his sudden loss of control. They prepared arguments regarding cognitive decline, aiming to prove Morgan lacked the necessary legal intent to commit a crime. In the entertainment industry, violent behavior is routinely scrubbed clean by checking a star into a luxury medical facility. The lawyers hoped a quick medical diagnosis would force the DA to drop the felony charges entirely. This aggressive strategy completely collapsed when the defense attorneys finally received the discovery file from the prosecutor. The moment they opened the envelope and looked at the police photographs, the medical excuses became instantly useless. You cannot blame a severely battered face and defensive bruising on a bad reaction to standard blood pressure medication. The visual evidence was stark, bloody, and entirely unambiguous to anyone looking at the glossy 8x10s. The high-priced lawyers realized they were holding a massive losing hand against a highly motivated district attorney. The crime scene photographs were the ultimate equalizer in the negotiation room. A picture of a 70-year-old woman with a swollen, bruised face cuts through any high-priced legal rhetoric or celebrity privilege. The defense team knew that if those photographs were ever projected on a large screen in a courtroom, Morgan would be ruined. The jury would not see the beloved, folksy actor from their Tuesday night television screens. They would see a cowardly, violent man who brutally beat his elderly wife behind locked doors. The state of California does not require the victim's active cooperation to prosecute a felony domestic assault case. This is a critical legal reality that Hollywood fixers often fail to understand when trying to buy their way out of trouble. Even if the defense attorneys pressured Barbara Bushman to recant her statement or refused to testify, the case would not disappear. The photographs, the medical reports, and the testimony of the responding officers were more than enough to secure a conviction. The state had assumed complete legal ownership of the crime, bypassing the victim entirely. Inside the executive suites holding the MASH syndication rights, the panic turned toxic upon receiving the evidence file from the defense attorneys. The entire financial ecosystem, worth hundreds of millions in licensing revenue, depended exclusively on Colonel Potter's sanitized image. If advertisers associating their products with his moral authority saw those crime scene photographs, local affiliates would instantly cancel their commercial buys. Prosecuting Harry Morgan was mathematically equivalent to setting the studio's vaults on fire. They did not need standard public relations. They needed the Los Angeles criminal justice system to stop functioning. The moment the formal complaint hit the open docket, the containment strategy pivoted. A filed felony charge is a public record. The legal team's initial attempts to quietly dismiss the case failed against the clinical weight of the medical reports. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office possessed solid, indisputable physical evidence of an aggravated assault and finalized the charging documents. Recognizing a rapidly closing window before courthouse stringers leaked the docket to national magazines, the studio bypassed standard public relations and deployed high-level fixers. They did not need to suppress the information forever, they just needed to control the initial blast radius. In 1996, the news cycle was entirely dictated by print publications and evening broadcast programs. If the studio could prevent the release of the crime scene photographs, they could manage the narrative. A story about a domestic dispute without visual evidence is just a rumor, but bloody photographs are permanent corporate damage. The defense lawyers immediately filed emergency motions to seal the evidentiary files, citing the privacy of the victim. This was a calculated legal maneuver designed to starve the press of the oxygen they needed to build a scandal. Judges in Los Angeles are often sympathetic to privacy arguments, especially when high-priced lawyers are pushing the paperwork. The motion was granted, locking the medical reports and the photographs of Barbara Bushman away from public view. The tabloids got wind of the arrest, but they had nothing tangible to print besides a bare-bones booking log. The studio had successfully blinded the press, buying themselves the time they needed to kill the actual criminal charges. This massive financial threat triggered the deployment of the syndication shield, an aggressive, off-the-books corporate defense mechanism. The studio bypassed their standard public relations representatives, immediately deploying high-level fixers. These individuals operate in the shadows of the entertainment industry, specializing in making massive liabilities quietly disappear. Their job was to strong-arm the district attorney's office into dropping the felony charges before a trial date could be set. They weaponized the studio's vast resources to grind the local criminal justice system to a complete halt. The negotiations between the elite defense lawyers and the Los Angeles prosecutors were brutal and entirely cynical. The defense team knew the DA had a rock-solid case with undeniable physical evidence of a severe beating. However, they also knew the DA's office was chronically underfunded, overworked, and desperate to clear their massive backlog of cases. A high-profile celebrity trial would drain incredible resources, taking prosecutors away from gang injunctions and murder trials. The defense leveraged this systemic weakness, threatening to drag the case out for years, with endless procedural delays and expensive appeals. The prosecutors were forced to make a cold bureaucratic calculation regarding the allocation of their limited taxpayer resources. They were holding a solid felony charge, but the victim was uncooperative, and the defense had limitless corporate funding. The studio fixers offered the DA a politically convenient exit ramp that would avoid a massive media circus. They proposed a standard plea deal, completely bypassing the felony conviction in exchange for a guaranteed quiet resolution. For a first-time offender in his 80s, a diversion program is standard legal protocol. However, for the studio, this routine legal leniency provided the perfect cover to rescue a billion-dollar asset without a messy public trial. The terms of the hush contract were finalized behind closed doors, far away from any public scrutiny. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office agreed to formally drop the devastating felony spousal battery charges against Morgan. In exchange, the 81-year-old actor would quietly enter a misdemeanor plea and agree to a specialized diversion program. The state of California essentially agreed to look the other way, classifying a brutal domestic assault as a minor, correctable mistake. The massive corporate shield had worked, successfully insulating a highly profitable asset from the consequences of his violent actions. Morgan was sentenced to complete a 6-month domestic violence counseling course, a standard anger management program typically assigned to first-time offenders involved in minor verbal altercations. It was a cosmetic punishment designed strictly to satisfy bureaucratic paperwork. Counselors, fully aware of his identity and corporate backing, simply checked the attendance boxes to facilitate the erasure of his record, providing the illusion of accountability. Morgan was not required to serve a single day of actual jail time beyond his initial overnight booking. He was not required to perform grueling community service or face any serious financial restitution that would impact his lifestyle. He simply had to attend a weekly class, sit in a plastic chair, and listen to a counselor talk about impulse control. Once he completed the required hours, the court agreed to permanently wipe the incident from his active criminal record. The studio had successfully purchased a completely clean slate for their most valuable grandfatherly television property. With the legal threat neutralized, the fixers weaponized access journalism to institute a total corporate blackout. Publicists monitored police scanners and courthouse dockets, aggressively contacting editors the moment a tabloid reporter inquired about the Brentwood address. They literally traded exclusive access to currently relevant A-list movie stars in exchange for burying the Morgan investigation. The major publications willingly participated in the cover-up, prioritizing their profit margins and studio relationships over investigative integrity. The press coverage was minimized to a few sanitized paragraphs mentioning a resolved minor dispute, effectively blinding the public to the felony reality and proving that in Hollywood, a profitable image will always supersede the truth. For Harry Morgan, the resolution of the case confirmed that he existed entirely outside the rules governing normal citizens. He had committed a violent felony, left his wife battered, and faced absolutely zero meaningful consequences for his actions. The studio had shown him that his television persona was a literal get-out-of-jail-free card. The 6 months of mandated counseling did not change the fundamental nature of the man who threw the punches. It only taught him that his corporate handlers would always be there to sweep the broken glass under the rug. The district attorney's office, having signed off on the misdemeanor plea, washed their hands of the entire affair. The prosecutors rationalized their decision by pointing to the crowded court dockets and the lack of cooperation from the victim's camp. They convinced themselves that forcing an 81-year-old man into a high-profile trial would look vindictive and politically motivated to the public. They ignored the brutal physical evidence and accepted the easy corporate exit, betraying the fundamental purpose of the justice system. They allowed a violent criminal to walk away clean simply because he had a famous face and limitless corporate backing. When Morgan finally completed the diversion program, he received a standardized certificate of completion from the court. This piece of paper was the final key required to permanently lock the Los Angeles police records away from public scrutiny. His defense lawyers filed the necessary expungement paperwork, legally erasing the arrest from the primary background check databases. If you searched his name in the standard public record system the following year, it would come back completely clean. The massive corporate washing machine had completed its cycle, returning the asset to pristine condition. By early 1997, the legal file was officially closed, and the crisis was considered permanently resolved by the studio. The executives went back to their corner offices, the fixers collected their massive bonuses, and the high-priced defense lawyers moved on to their next celebrity client. The machine had functioned perfectly, neutralizing a massive threat to the bottom line with surgical precision. They had successfully defended the syndication shield, ensuring the rerun money would continue to flow uninterrupted into the next decade. The business of Hollywood continued, completely unbothered by the violence it had just aggressively covered up. The operation was a masterclass in the ruthless application of Hollywood power. The studio successfully rewrote history to protect protect their financial interests, proving that corporate leverage could effectively erase a brutal assault from existence. But the most chilling aspect of the entire cover-up was the silent return to normalcy inside the Brentwood home. The studio executives and the high-priced lawyers did not care what happened to Barbara Bushman once the legal threat was neutralized. They packed up their briefcases, cashed their massive checks, and left her completely isolated with the man who had caused her injuries. The legal system had effectively endorsed the violence, confirming to Morgan that his actions carried zero permanent consequences. The house was quiet again, but it was the terrifying silence of a victim who realized nobody was ever coming to help her. When the Los Angeles legal system officially expunged the arrest record, Harry Morgan ceased to be a functioning, independent human being in the eyes of the entertainment industry. He transitioned directly into a highly managed corporate asset. The studio executives had just spent a small fortune protecting his image, and they were not going to let him roam freely and risk another catastrophic public relations failure. From late 1996 onward, Morgan was placed into a quiet, heavily monitored form of professional exile. He was retired from active daily production schedules, but he was permanently tethered to the legacy of Colonel Potter. The late 1990s introduced a massive shift in how television properties were monetized. The traditional syndication model of selling VHS tapes and local broadcast rights was suddenly eclipsed by the explosion of the DVD box set market. Studios realized that consumers were willing to pay premium prices to own entire seasons of classic television shows in high quality. MASH was immediately flagged as a Tier 1 priority for DVD authoring and distribution. This new revenue pipeline required fresh promotional material, which meant the studio had to drag the aging cast back out into the public eye. Selling a premium DVD box set requires the illusion of a happy, unified cast reflecting on their golden years. The marketing departments demanded new commentary tracks, retrospective interviews, and heavily promoted reunion specials to drive retail sales. Morgan was 82 years old and completely financially secure, but his contracts and the industry's unwritten rules mandated his participation. He was called back to the studio lots, required to sit in front of the cameras, and ordered to play the grandfatherly patriarch one more time. The executives who had buried his domestic violence file were now booking his promotional flights. Bringing an octogenarian actor back onto a soundstage is a highly calculated logistical operation. The studio did not send regular production assistants to handle Morgan. They assigned senior publicists and specialized handlers. These individuals were tasked with ensuring he arrived on time, hit his marks, and most importantly, stayed strictly on the approved talking points. They managed his physical appearance meticulously, using heavy studio makeup to cover the physical decline of his advanced age. The goal was to freeze him in time, presenting the audience with the exact same Colonel Potter they remembered from 1983. The environment on these reunion sets was a master class in industry hypocrisy. The producers, the directors, and the senior cast members were fully aware of the 1996 arrest and the severity of the LAPD file. The entertainment industry operates on a massive whisper network, and the details of the Brentwood assault were common knowledge among the Hollywood elite. But when the red light on the camera illuminated, a collective amnesia descended over the entire room. The actors sat on comfortable couches, smiled warmly at Morgan, and traded rehearsed anecdotes about their wonderful years working together. Nobody asked about the 6 months of court-mandated anger management. Nobody mentioned the swollen eye or the lacerated feet of his elderly wife. The interviewers assigned to these specials were usually compliant entertainment journalists who understood the rules of the game. They asked soft, nostalgic questions designed to elicit comforting, folksy answers from the aging actor. They were acting as unpaid public relations representatives for the studio's DVD division, ensuring the product remained clean and highly marketable. Morgan executed his end of the bargain flawlessly. He possessed decades of experience in masking his reality behind a script, and the reunion specials were just another performance. He smiled on cue, delivered his famous catchphrases with the expected gravelly warmth, and provided the exact sound bites the editors needed. It was a terrifying display of compartmentalization. The man sitting under the studio lights, projecting absolute moral authority, was the exact same man who had brutally beaten a 70-year-old woman just a few years prior. This is the phase of a Hollywood career that insiders refer to as the ghost in the shell. Morgan was no longer actively creating art or contributing to new television properties. He was simply animating a dead character to satisfy the financial demands of a corporate board. He had to wear the skin of a television saint while carrying the reality of a violent criminal. The psychological toll of maintaining this profound disconnect is something the industry actively ignores, as long as the DVD units continue to ship to retail stores. The nostalgia industrial complex only accelerated as the calendar turned into the 2000s. Cable networks like TV Land built their entire business models on broadcasting classic television reruns to older demographics. To legitimize their networks, they created massive televised award shows dedicated exclusively to legacy properties. MASH was a permanent fixture at these events, required to accept Impact Awards and pop culture honors year after year. The studio mandated that Morgan attend these ceremonies, forcing him to walk red carpets and wave to the crowds. These award shows are not about artistic merit. They are highly produced commercials designed to inflate advertising rates. Morgan was paraded onto the stage at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in front of thousands of cheering industry professionals. He stood alongside his former co-stars, accepting heavy glass trophies and standing ovations from the crowd. The executives sitting in the front rows applauded enthusiastically, celebrating the billion-dollar asset they had successfully protected from the penal code. It was a victory lap for the corporate fixers who had successfully buried the truth. The physical reality of aging eventually began to interfere with the studio's demands. By the time the 30th anniversary reunion special aired on the Fox network in 2002, Morgan was 87 years old. His physical decline was visible, even under the heavy studio lighting and professional makeup. His voice had lost some of its commanding bark, and his movements were significantly slower and more deliberate. The studio realized their primary moral anchor was reaching the end of his operational lifespan, forcing them to extract as much promotional value from him as quickly as possible. Behind the scenes of these later appearances, the handlers were working overtime to maintain the illusion. They limited his time on stage, tightly controlled his interactions with the press, and ensured he was never put in a position where he had to speak extemporaneously. They treated him like a fragile, highly explosive piece of corporate hardware. If he became confused or irritable during a live recording, it could shatter the grandfatherly image they had spent millions protecting. The priority was absolute control over every single frame of footage captured by the network cameras. After the award shows wrapped, handlers loaded Morgan into a town car and returned him to his Brentwood estate. The industry rented his face for the evening, then discarded him back into the same isolated residence where the 1996 assault had occurred, shielded by iron gates and security systems. By 2005, Morgan finally aged out of the promotional machinery and retreated entirely behind the walls of his estate. The studio shifted its focus to maintaining the brand without his physical presence, silently securing the perimeter around his private life. When Morgan passed away from pneumonia in December 2011 at age 96, the corporate machine executed its final protocol. Major publications unlocked pre-written obituaries celebrating the grandfather of television, completely omitting the 1996 LAPD records. The syndication metrics briefly spiked, concluding the asset's life cycle as the industry extracted its final margins and shifted its attention forward. The timeline of Harry Morgan demonstrates the core functionality of the entertainment industry. The screen is a highly engineered glass cage designed strictly to optimize profit. The industry possesses the capital and the machinery to manufacture saints, but it cannot fundamentally alter the reality of the individuals operating behind the masks. When audiences view classic television properties today, the visual evidence on the screen directly contradicts the historical record. The boundary between the benevolent Sherman T. Potter and the violent reality of Harry Morgan is absolute. Corporate fixers can bury the crimes of an asset under millions of dollars in legal settlements and access journalism. But the truth is not entirely erased. It remains permanently archived, written in clinical detail within the physical evidence reports of the Los Angeles Police Department.